November 12, 1944. The transport truck rumbled through the gates of Camp Hereford, a makeshift prisoner of war facility 30 miles outside San Antonio, Texas. Inside the covered cargo bed, 42 German women sat in silence, their gray auxiliary uniforms dusty from 3 days of travel from the East Coast Processing Center. They had been captured in France during the final Allied push through occupied territory, serving as communications specialists, medical personnel, and administrative staff for retreating Wehrmacht units. Now they were prisoners in a country most of them had been taught to despise. Charlotte Werner pressed her face close to the canvas opening, catching glimpses of a landscape that seemed impossibly vast and untouched by war. At 25, she had spent the last 6 years watching Berlin transform from a vibrant capital into a city of rations, blackouts, and fear. The Texas sky stretched endlessly above them, unmarred by bomber formations or anti-aircraft fire. It was disconcerting in its peacefulness. Beside her, 21-year-old Ilse Kruger clutched a small cloth bag containing her only possessions: a change of underclothes, a wooden comb, and a photograph of her family in Dresden. Her hands trembled slightly, though whether from fear or exhaustion, Charlotte could not tell. They had not spoken much during the journey. What was there to say? They were defeated enemies in a foreign land, facing an uncertain future. Rosa Muller, at 29, the oldest among their small group, maintained the rigid posture of someone who refused to show weakness. She had been a senior radio operator, one of the few women trusted with sensitive communications. Her sharp features and steel gray eyes suggested a woman who had seen too much to be easily frightened. Yet Charlotte noticed how Rosa's jaw clenched as the truck came to a stop. Sophie Vogel, 23, had served as a translator before her capture. She spoke English well, having studied it at university in Heidelberg before the war consumed everything. She would become invaluable in the coming months, though none of them knew it yet. For now, she simply looked pale and worried, her dark blonde hair escaping from beneath her military cap. The truck's tailgate dropped open with a metallic clang. American soldiers stood waiting, their uniforms crisp despite the Texas heat. A tall woman in officer's insignia stepped forward, her expression neither cruel nor kind, simply professional. This was Captain Eleanor Rhodes, though the German women would not learn her name until later. What struck Charlotte most in that first moment was not the barbed wire or the guard towers or the barracks that would become their new home. It was the sight of the mess hall in the distance and the unmistakable smell of cooking food drifting across the compound. Real food. Not the thin soups and black bread that had sustained Germany for years. Something else entirely. Something they had almost forgotten existed in the world. The German women were processed through intake procedures with efficient American thoroughness. They surrendered their few remaining possessions for inventory, received clean prison uniforms marked with large letters spelling out the designation they now carried, and were assigned bunks in a long wooden barracks that smelled of fresh pine and disinfectant. The entire process took less than 3 hours, a stark contrast to the chaotic conditions they had experienced during their capture and initial detention in Europe. By 1800 hours, Corporal Helen Foster, a brisk woman in her 30s with kind eyes, led them to the mess hall for their first meal. Charlotte noticed how the American guards maintained distance but showed no obvious hostility. Private Michael Chen, a young Chinese-American soldier from California, held the door open as the women filed inside. The gesture was small but unexpected. In their experience, prisoners were herded, not accommodated. The mess hall was larger than Charlotte had anticipated, with long tables arranged in neat rows. The November evening sun streamed through western windows, casting golden light across the room. But it was not the architecture that caused 42 German women to stop and stare in collective disbelief. It was what waited on the serving line. Sergeant William Crawford, known to everyone as Bill, stood behind the steam tables with 2 kitchen assistants. He was a broad-shouldered man in his 40s from Tennessee, with flour permanently dusted into the creases of his hands. He had been cooking for the army since 1942, and he believed that a well-fed soldier was a soldier who could think clearly. He extended this philosophy even to prisoners. The German women moved through the line in stunned silence. On each tray appeared portions of food that seemed incomprehensible given their understanding of wartime rationing. There was roasted chicken, not the stringy, scarce meat they remembered from Germany, but actual substantial pieces. There were mashed potatoes with butter, not the turnip substitutes that had become standard in Berlin. There were green beans, dinner rolls, and on each tray, a small cup of what appeared to be fruit cocktail. Charlotte accepted her tray with hands that shook slightly. She had not seen food like this since before the war began. In Germany, even officers received meager rations. The civilian population survived on ersatz coffee, made from acorns, bread stretched with sawdust, and whatever vegetables could be coaxed from victory gardens. Yet here, in a prison camp, they were being served a meal that would have been considered luxurious in Berlin. Rosa Müller whispered in German to Ilse, "This cannot be real. It must be some kind of trick." But the food was real, and the aroma was real, and when they sat at the long tables and took their first bites, the taste was undeniably, impossibly real. The weeks following their arrival established a routine that felt increasingly surreal to the German women. Each morning they woke to reveal, performed assigned duties, maintaining the camp facilities, and attended English language classes offered by Corporal Foster. But it was the meals that continued to challenge everything they thought they knew about wartime America. Sergeant Crawford's kitchen produced food with a consistency and quality that seemed to mock the propaganda they had been fed about a struggling enemy nation. Charlotte found herself assigned to administrative duties, helping to organize camp records under Captain Rhodes's supervision. The work was tedious, but gave her access to American newspapers that occasionally made their way to the office. She read accounts of the war's progress, of Allied advances, and of the home front. What struck her most were the advertisements. Even in wartime, American magazines featured glossy images of automobiles, household appliances, and abundant food. It seemed impossible that a nation at war could maintain such domestic prosperity. Sophie's language skills made her invaluable as an interpreter during the daily camp operations. She found herself in frequent conversation with Private Chen, whose patient demeanor made him easy to approach. He told her about his family's grocery store in San Francisco, about growing up between two cultures, about his decision to enlist despite the discrimination Chinese Americans faced. His openness confused her. Why would an enemy soldier share personal stories with a German prisoner? As Thanksgiving approached in late November, Sergeant Crawford began planning something special. He had requested additional supplies through military channels, and when the delivery truck arrived on the 21st, Charlotte watched from the administrative office window as crates were unloaded into the kitchen. She could not see what they contained, but Crawford's satisfied expression suggested something significant. The day before Thanksgiving, Ilse was working in the camp infirmary when she overheard two American medics discussing the upcoming meal. They mentioned turkey, stuffing, cranberry sauce, and something called banana pudding. The last item meant nothing to her. She had never heard the term before. When she asked Sophie about it later that evening, the translator looked thoughtful. "Bananen," she said slowly in German. "Bananas. I remember them from before the war. Yellow fruit from tropical places. They stopped coming to Germany in 1939 when the British blockade began." The word triggered a cascade of memories among the women in the barracks that night. Rosa remembered eating a banana at age 23, shortly before the war started. It had been an expensive luxury even then, imported from some distant colony. Charlotte recalled seeing them in Berlin markets as a child, exotic and expensive. Ilse, at 21, had only the vaguest memory of the taste. She had been 15 when they disappeared from German shops entirely. None of them could imagine that such fruit still existed anywhere in a world at war. Thanksgiving Day, 1944, arrived with unseasonably warm weather for late November in Texas. The German women had been instructed that they would participate in the American holiday meal, though most of them had only the vaguest understanding of what Thanksgiving represented. Sophie explained what she knew: a harvest festival, a day of gratitude, something uniquely American that combined religious tradition with national identity. The mess hall had been decorated with autumn leaves and hand-drawn turkeys, created by soldiers with artistic inclinations. It seemed almost absurd to Charlotte that their captors would bother with such details for prisoners. Yet there it was, an attempt to create festivity in a place designed for confinement. Captain Rhodes had made clear that this meal was meant to demonstrate American values of abundance and generosity, even toward enemies. When the women entered the mess hall at noon, they found the American soldiers already seated at some tables, leaving others open for the prisoners. This integrated seating arrangement was new. Previously, the groups had maintained separate sections. Private Chen gestured for Charlotte and her companions to sit at a table near the serving line, his smile genuine and encouraging. Sergeant Crawford and his kitchen crew had outdone themselves. The serving line groaned under the weight of traditional Thanksgiving fare: roasted turkeys with crispy golden skin, herb stuffing fragrant with sage and thyme, mashed potatoes whipped to creamy perfection, rich brown gravy, green bean casserole topped with crispy onions, sweet potato casserole with pecans, fresh baked rolls with butter, cranberry sauce, both jellied and whole berry. The abundance was staggering. But it was what waited at the end of the serving line that caused Rosa to stop so suddenly that Ilse nearly collided with her. In large glass baking dishes sat something none of them had seen in over 5 years. Layers of golden custard, vanilla wafer cookies, and sliced bananas topped with peaks of white meringue browned to perfection. The dessert seemed to glow under the mess hall lights. "That's banana pudding," Sergeant Crawford said, noticing their transfixed stares. "Family recipe from my grandmother in Tennessee. Thought you ladies might enjoy something special today." He spoke slowly, knowing Sophie would need to translate for those whose English remained limited. Charlotte accepted her serving with hands that trembled. The slice of banana on top was pale yellow, exactly as she remembered from childhood. She carried her tray to the table in a daze, barely noticing the rest of her meal. Around her, the other German women wore similar expressions of disbelief and something deeper, something that looked almost like grief. When she finally lifted the spoon to her mouth, the taste transported her instantly to a world before war, before rationing, before everything changed. Sweet, creamy, with the distinctive flavor of banana that no substitute could replicate. Tears streamed down her face before she realized she was crying. Charlotte was not the only one crying. Around the mess hall, German women sat with tears streaming down their faces as they tasted banana pudding for the first time in over 5 years. Some wept silently, others covered their faces with their hands, overwhelmed by emotions they could not articulate. It was not simply the taste of the dessert, though that was extraordinary enough. It was what the taste represented: a world they had lost, a normalcy they had forgotten existed, a stark reminder of everything the war had taken from them. Private Chen, seated across from Charlotte, looked alarmed by the emotional response. He glanced at Sergeant Crawford uncertainly, wondering if they had somehow made a mistake. But Corporal Foster, with her deeper understanding of human nature, simply passed boxes of tissues down the tables without comment. She understood that sometimes kindness hurt more than cruelty because it reminded you of what you had been missing. Sophie was the first to compose herself enough to speak. In halting English, she addressed Sergeant Crawford, who had emerged from the kitchen to observe the response to his cooking. "Sergeant, this banana we have not seen since 1939. In Germany, they stopped coming. First they became expensive, then impossible to find. We forgot that such things still existed in the world." Crawford looked genuinely surprised. He had known about rationing in Germany from intelligence reports, but he had not fully grasped what years without basic pleasures meant to ordinary people. "Ma'am," he said respectfully, In America, we've got rationing too. Sugar, butter, coffee, meat, but bananas still come from Central America. They're not rationed, just sometimes hard to get. I had to request them special for today." The conversation opened something that had been sealed since the women's arrival. Rosa, usually so rigid and controlled, found herself explaining in her limited English what German rations looked like. The bread made with sawdust, the coffee made from acorns, the meat that appeared once a week if you were lucky. Private Chen listened with growing understanding, then shared his own family's experience with Japanese-American internment camps, the fear and displacement his community had endured. The parallel was not exact, but the human connection was real. Both groups had been caught in forces larger than themselves. Both had suffered. Both had lost the world they once knew. The simple act of sharing a meal, of sitting at the same tables, began dissolving the barriers between captor and captive. Ilse, emboldened by the emotional openness around her, asked Captain Rhodes a question that had been haunting her since arrival. "Captain, why do you feed us so well? We are your enemies. We expected punishment, not kindness." Rhodes considered her response carefully before speaking. "Because," she said simply, "treating people with dignity is what separates us from those who don't." The days following Thanksgiving marked a subtle but profound shift in the atmosphere at Camp Hereford. The banana pudding had done more than satisfy a craving or trigger nostalgia. It had cracked open a conversation about what the war really meant, what it had taken from everyone involved, and what the fundamental differences were between the two nations now locked in mortal combat. Charlotte found herself thinking constantly about abundance. Not just the presence of bananas, but what their presence signified. In Germany, she had been taught that America was weak, decadent, stretched thin by fighting on multiple fronts. The propaganda had insisted that the Allied nations were suffering, that their populations were starving, that victory for the Reich was inevitable because Germany's enemies lacked the strength to sustain their war effort. Yet here was the evidence that contradicted everything she had been told. America was fighting a massive war across two oceans, supplying allies in Europe and Asia, maintaining millions of soldiers in the field, and still, somehow, Sergeant Crawford could order bananas from Central America for a Thanksgiving dessert. The cognitive dissonance was overwhelming. If the propaganda had been wrong about American weakness, what else had been lies? Rosa articulated what many of them were thinking during an evening conversation in the barracks. "It's not just that they have food," she said in German, her voice low and troubled. "It's that they can afford to share it with us, with their enemies. In Germany, we are starving, and still we are told we are winning. But how can a winning nation starve while a losing nation feasts?" Sophie had been reading American newspapers with increasing comprehension. Her English improved daily through constant practice with Corporal Foster and Private Chen. What she discovered in those pages troubled her even more than the food disparity. American newspapers freely criticized their own government, questioned military strategies, and published casualty figures. In Germany, such openness would have been treasonous. "They have abundance of more than food," she observed. "They have abundance of truth, or at least the possibility of it." Ilse, still the youngest among them, struggled most with these revelations. She had been only 15 when the war began, had known nothing of adult life before Nazi control shaped everything. The world she was discovering in Texas bore no resemblance to the world she thought she understood. "If everything we believed was false," she asked one night, "then who are we? What were we fighting for?" The question hung in the air without answer. Captain Rhodes, making her evening rounds, overheard the conversation through the barracks window. She did not intervene or announce her presence. Some realizations had to come from within, could not be imposed from outside. The German women were beginning to understand that abundance was not about quantity alone. It was about a system that could maintain plenty even under strain, about values that insisted on dignity even for enemies, about a confidence rooted not in propaganda but in genuine strength. December brought colder weather to Texas. though nothing compared to the brutal winters Charlotte remembered from Berlin. The camp routine had become familiar, almost comfortable. The German women worked their assigned duties, attended English classes, and participated in the daily rhythms of camp life with decreasing resistance. But as Christmas approached, thoughts of home became inescapable. The Red Cross had established procedures for prisoner correspondence, allowing limited letters to be sent to family members in Germany through neutral Switzerland. Each woman was permitted to write one letter per month, subject to censorship by American authorities. The letters could contain no military information, no criticism of captors, nothing that might compromise security. What remained was the nearly impossible task of explaining their current reality to families who could not possibly understand it. Charlotte sat in the barracks common room with paper and pen, trying to find words for her mother in Berlin. How could she explain that she was being treated well, fed abundantly, shown unexpected kindness? Her mother was surviving on ration cards that provided barely enough calories to sustain life. Her younger brother was fighting on the Eastern Front, if he was still alive. Her father had died in an Allied bombing raid 2 years earlier. How could she write about banana pudding to people who were starving? She wrote and discarded draft after draft. "Dear Mama, I am well and being treated fairly" seemed inadequate and somehow insulting. "The Americans are not what we were told" felt dangerous, both for herself and for her family, who might face consequences for receiving such statements. Finally, she settled on careful neutrality. "Dear Mama, I am safe and healthy. I hope this letter finds you well. I think of you every day and pray for your safety. Your loving daughter, Charlotte." Sophie faced a different dilemma. Her family in Heidelberg had been educated, cosmopolitan, quietly opposed to the Nazi regime, though never openly defiant. Her father, a university professor, had been forced into retirement in 1941 for insufficient enthusiasm for party ideology. She wanted to tell them everything she was learning, about American openness and abundance, about the lies they had all been fed. But such honesty could endanger them if her letter was intercepted by German authorities before reaching Switzerland. Rosa wrote nothing at all. She had received notification through the Red Cross that her entire family in Cologne had been killed in a bombing raid in October. Her husband, her 2 children, her parents, all gone. She had no one to write to, no one waiting for her return. The knowledge sat inside her like a stone, cold and immovable. The other women respected her silence, understood that some losses were too vast for words. Ilse wrote cheerful lies to her parents in Dresden. She described the camp in minimal terms, assured them she was unharmed, promised she would return home soon. She did not mention the banana pudding, or the kindness of Private Chen, or the growing suspicion that everything she had believed about the war was false. Winter deepened into 1945, and with the new year came increasingly clear signs that Germany was losing the war. American newspapers, which Sophie now read fluently, reported Soviet advances from the east and Allied progress from the west. The Reich, that had promised 1,000 years, was collapsing after only 12. For the German women at Camp Hereford, these reports brought not triumph for their captors but a growing dread about what awaited them when the war finally ended. Captain Rhodes received official communications in February regarding repatriation procedures for female prisoners of war. The policies were still being formulated in Washington, but the general expectation was that all German POWs would be returned to their homeland within months of the war's conclusion. For most of the women, this news should have brought relief. They were going home. But home to what? Charlotte had finally received a letter from her mother, passed through the Red Cross after months of delay. The single page, written in shaky handwriting, painted a picture of devastation. Berlin was in ruins. Food was nearly non-existent. The population lived in cellars, emerging only when necessary, constantly under threat from Soviet artillery as the Red Army approached from the east. Her mother's final line haunted Charlotte. "I do not know if I will survive to see you again, but know that I love you and release you from any obligation to return to this hell." The letter changed everything. Her mother, in careful language that had survived censorship, was telling her not to come back. Charlotte read and reread those words, trying to understand their full meaning. Was this permission to seek a different future, or simply a mother's love trying to spare her daughter from suffering? Similar letters arrived for other women, or more commonly, no letters arrived at all. Sophie learned that Heidelberg had been heavily damaged in Allied bombing. She had no information about her family's fate. Ilse received word that Dresden had been destroyed in a massive firebombing raid in February, with tens of thousands dead. She did not know if her parents had survived. Rosa, who had already lost everyone, watched her companions grapple with uncertainty and felt a strange relief that she at least knew the worst. In the barracks at night, the conversations grew, more intense and more desperate. Some women clung to the hope that Germany would recover, that they could help rebuild, that their duty remained with their homeland regardless of its condition. Others, particularly those who had no confirmed family survivors, began to question whether return was either possible or desirable. They had spent months experiencing a different way of life, had seen abundance instead of scarcity, openness instead of propaganda, dignity instead of cruelty. Private Chen, during one of his guard shifts, overheard fragments of these German conversations. He understood enough of the language now to grasp their distress. He mentioned it to Sergeant Crawford, who brought it to Captain Rhodes. The question that emerged was simple but unprecedented. What if some of the prisoners did not want to go home? What if they chose to stay? May 8, 1945. Victory in Europe Day. The news crackled over the radio in the camp administration building, and within minutes, everyone at Camp Hereford knew that Germany had surrendered unconditionally. The war in Europe was over. American soldiers celebrated with restrained jubilation, aware that the war in the Pacific continued and that many of them would soon be reassigned to that theater. For the German women, the announcement brought a complex tangle of emotions: relief that the killing had stopped, grief for their defeated nation, and profound anxiety about what came next. Captain Rhodes called a general assembly for all prisoners 3 days after the surrender. The women gathered in the mess hall, the same space where they had tasted banana pudding 6 months earlier. That moment felt like a lifetime ago. They had been different people then, still clinging to remnants of propaganda and national pride. Now they were simply tired women facing an uncertain future. Rhodes stood before them with official documents from the War Department. Her expression was compassionate but professional. "Ladies," she began, with Sophie translating for those whose English remained limited, "I have received orders regarding your repatriation to Germany. Transportation will be arranged within the next 4 to 6 weeks. You will be processed through displaced persons camps in Europe before being released to return to your homes or to locate surviving family members." She paused, studying their faces. She had spent months observing these women, watching them transform from rigid enemy soldiers into real people with fears, hopes, and personalities. She had read their censored letters, understood their losses, witnessed their growing disillusionment with the regime they had served. What she said next was not in her official orders but came from her own sense of humanity. "I want you to understand," Rhodes continued carefully, "that repatriation is your right under the Geneva Convention. However, I also want you to know that the United States government is developing policies for displaced persons who have nowhere to return to, or who fear persecution if they return. If any of you fall into those categories, there may be options beyond immediate repatriation." The words hung in the air like an unexpected lifeline thrown to drowning swimmers. Charlotte felt her heart begin to race. Sophie's translation into German caused a ripple of whispered conversations throughout the hall. Rosa sat motionless, her face unreadable. Ilse looked as if she might cry. That evening the barracks erupted into passionate debate. Some women argued that their duty remained with Germany, that their country needed them most in its darkest hour, that abandoning their homeland would be the final betrayal. Others countered that they had no homeland to return to, that the Germany they had known no longer existed, that they had been released from obligation by circumstances beyond their control. Charlotte found herself in the latter camp, though she struggled with guilt over the decision. She thought about her mother's letter, about the permission implicit in those final words. She thought about banana pudding, yes, but more importantly, about what it represented. A society that could maintain abundance and dignity even during wartime, that could show kindness to enemies, that could offer second chances to those willing to embrace different values. 23 years later, in 1968, Charlotte Werner stood in the kitchen of her modest home in San Antonio, Texas, preparing banana pudding for her daughter's 8th birthday party. Her hands moved with practiced efficiency, layering vanilla wafers, sliced bananas, and custard in a glass dish, exactly as Sergeant Crawford had taught her decades earlier. She had learned the recipe from him during her final months at Camp Hereford, when she had worked in the kitchen as part of her transition from prisoner to displaced person to immigrant. Her daughter, Emily, burst into the kitchen with the boundless energy of childhood, speaking in rapid English, with a Texas accent that still sometimes startled Charlotte. This American child, born free and confident, bore no resemblance to the frightened German prisoner her mother had once been. Emily had never known hunger, never experienced the weight of propaganda, never had to question whether her country's values aligned with basic human decency. Charlotte's husband, Daniel, a veteran who had served in the Pacific Theater, appeared in the doorway. He had met Charlotte in 1948 when she was working as a translator for the State Department, helping to process the flood of European refugees seeking new lives in America. Their courtship had been cautious, both of them carrying wounds from the war, but they had built something solid together. A marriage based on honesty, a home filled with love, a life that honored the second chance Charlotte had been given. Later that evening, after the birthday cake had been served and Emily's friends had gone home, Charlotte sat on her porch, watching the Texas sunset. She still kept in touch with others from Camp Hereford. Sophie had settled in California, married a university professor, and taught German literature. Ilse had returned to Germany in 1946, unable to abandon the search for her parents. She had found her mother alive in Dresden and had written to Charlotte about the difficult but necessary work of rebuilding. Rosa had chosen to stay in America, but had struggled with survivor's guilt for years before finding peace through work with refugee organizations. Of the 42 German women who had arrived at Camp Hereford in November 1944, 14 had ultimately chosen to remain in the United States. The others had returned to Germany with varying degrees of success in rebuilding their lives. There was no single right answer to the question they had all faced. Each woman had made the choice that her conscience demanded. Charlotte thought about that first taste of banana pudding on Thanksgiving Day, 1944. At the time, she had not understood what it meant. She thought it was about the fruit, about abundance, about the shock of plenty in a world of scarcity. But 23 years of perspective had taught her differently. The banana pudding had been about something deeper. The recognition that enemies could become friends, that transformation was possible, that human dignity transcended national boundaries. She could still taste that first bite if she concentrated, still feel the tears that had streamed down her face. Not tears of grief, though there had been grief. Not tears of joy, though there had been joy. Tears of recognition. In that moment, she had tasted not just dessert, but the possibility of becoming someone new, someone better, someone free.